Well, it's great to be back in this space. It's hard to believe that 1 year ago this week was the last time any of us were together in this space. And at the time, we didn't imagine how long this would be. But now I am grateful for signs of hope. Spring is on the way, and with the flowers, we're also getting vaccines. The pandemic has not kept us from being community. Through this year, book groups and Bible studies have allowed us to share smiles. And I love the way that friends have jumped in to help those elusive appointments get connected with people struggling with this scattered system. So thank you for being awesome. But in this time, the one thing that we have not been able to get back are the hugs. We still miss the physical closeness and the reassurance that comes from being in the same room, face to face. So having realized how important that physical connection is, this Lenten season, we want to recognize how physical our spirituality truly is, and to consider what it means to honor human bodies as holy places, which is not an easy thing to do in religious traditions that have too often viewed the body as inherently shameful and somehow bad and dangerous, even in our secular culture that commodifies the body, that uses bodies for making profit. It is hard to recognize our true worth. For most of the time, we see our bodies as something that needs to be conquered or tamed. We've learned to see our flaws so much more clearly than we see our dignity and our beauty. We've been taught not to trust our bodies or our emotions or our intuitions or our ability to choose and act. So how can we learn to see embodied lives, our sensory lives, our physical and emotional lives as interconnected and essential to our lives with God? I think if we come to our scriptures with an openness for new possibilities, we might just find the answers we need. And there's so much to learn from the gospel story that we're reading today. I love this story. It is so full of things that enrich our lives. This is the story that has come to be known as the cleansing of the temple. And Jesus is angry. He's angry at what he sees happening in and around the temple, and he reacts, and he acts zealously with energy and with anger. And he speaks his truth, and he makes his opinion known. Now we're told, as we read in the temple courts, he found people who were selling cattle and sheep and doves. There were others who were sitting at tables and they were exchanging money. And so he made a whip out of cords and he drove them all out of the temple courts, the sheep and the cattle, and he scattered the coins of the money changers and he overturned their tables. To those selling doves, he told them, "Get out and stop turning my father's house into a market." Now, he had nothing against the animals, but it was the business schemes that Jesus encountered that were just too much for him to accept. For families had to bring their very best animal to sacrifice at the temple, and then it had to be inspected to make sure it was pure enough to be acceptable. And, well, if that animal was rejected, there were substitutes available at a price. And then the family offered a payment for that. Well, the money could be rejected since average people only had Roman coins. But not to worry. These coins could be exchanged for the correct temple currency, again, at a price. And all of this commercial activity has cluttered up the court of the Gentiles so that foreigners no longer had a place to worship God. These money changers contributed to injustices that were hurting human lives. So Jesus directed his anger at a corrupt, destructive system. It was not towards people that he might have a personal grudge with. It was looking at what the system was doing to human lives. And I'm sure even his followers were shocked at this unexpected rage, because we still don't hear much about anger in churches these days. There's something unseemly about rage, something uncomfortable. It's not polite to get angry. And yet Jesus burned with zeal, we are told. He didn't use nice words to placate people this time. He allowed this holy anger to move him to action on behalf of the helpless and the voiceless. And this kind of anger, this anger of Jesus, is something that we desperately need. We need this discomfort, for this kind of discomfort is actually part of our healing. Jesus' anger doesn't destroy, it actually saves and heals. Jesus' experience and expression of anger are important for our understanding of an embodied faith. For after all, it is in our bodies that we experience deep anger, deep pain, as well as our deepest joys. It's my chest that hurts when I mourn. It's my face that burns when I'm angry. It's my whole body that warms with delight when I am happy. Beverly Harrison reminds us that wherever feeling is evaded, where anger is hidden or goes unattended, masking itself, there also the power of love, the power to act and to deepen relationship, atrophies and dies as well. So here Jesus has shown us how to feel and use our anger. This was not an act of violence. No one was hurt in this event. There were tables turned and money scattered on the ground, but no swords were drawn, no punches were thrown, and I'm pretty sure no animals were harmed in the making of this story. It tells us how we can care for others and embrace and use our anger when it is needed. Now, that is one thing that we can learn from this passage. There's another, maybe even more important thing that we begin to learn from this story. It's a change that changes us. In this story, in this event, our image of God changes. The temple leaders asked Jesus to justify his disruptive actions with some sign of his authority, which, actually makes sense, because if you don't want to get arrested for assault or for disturbing the peace, you better be able to prove that you have the authority to change the system. Now, instead of a simple explanation, Jesus responds with another confusing line when he says, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." Later, much later, his disciples would interpret Jesus' words as a prediction of his death and resurrection. But in that moment, it just didn't make sense. Was he threatening to destroy the temple? What was he trying to do? I think he did want to restore that temple to its purpose as a place of prayer for all people. But Jesus is also doing something even greater than that. From this time on, God's presence would no longer be constrained to a particular location. For God's covenant is now shown to be with all people who worship in spirit and in truth. The temple in Jerusalem, that building would later be destroyed and rebuilt, but the ability to worship would not depend on that place or any place. Thomas Truby points out that Jesus is threatening the temple's authority and their power by declaring them unnecessary. For with this action, Jesus is saying that God loves all people, God has no wrath towards them, and therefore does not need or want them to sacrifice animals or birds or children or any other creature to appease their God. He is saying God doesn't need to be appeased. And if this is true, if Jesus is right, then that temple system would be unnecessary. The sacrifice-selling vendors and the money changers and the administrators would be out of business. and certainly that change would be difficult. But what was also true was that the nonviolent, totally benevolent face of God that Jesus was showing and teaching, well, it would also apply to them. For in the crucifixion, even as they were killing him, Jesus declared God's love towards them, forgiving them. This was the point of transformation. For since humans have seen God as wrathful, we have attempted to appease God so that God would be good to us, that God would let us live. And the temple was an example of an institution that carried out that kind of transaction. People used their scarce and hard-earned money to buy animals that would then be slaughtered and burned on the altar so that the one who brought the creatures would be safe from misfortune or disease, believed to be caused by an angry God who hadn't been paid yet. But what if God is not angry? What if God is actually forgiving? Then this is not necessary. Instead of allowing us to believe that God is wrathful and in need of being paid off to placate this wrath, Jesus undercuts the whole system, showing us that God is not wrathful and God is not violent. The one who not only loves us when we behave, but also forgives us when we don't. This is the God that Jesus is showing to us. And this changes everything. And this is why we share the Lord's Supper. And today we will take this communion together with this understanding that Jesus has replaced the ritual of sacrifice with a symbol of his life and his death. He replaces the sacrificed animal with bread and wine as an always to be reenacted reminder of his nonviolent, self-giving death and resurrection. So together this morning, we will remember this life that is given for all by this God who loves us no matter what, as we share the Lord's Supper.